Konnichiwa. Today we're going to talk about spoken output in Japanese, or what in more natural English is termed talking. We're going to cover a few aspects of this. How early should you start? Is it dangerous to start early? Do you need to do it at all? And if we are going to do it, how do we go about it in the early stages? So let's first of all tackle this myth that's going around the internet and dominating certain online Japanese enthusiast circles, and that is the idea that it's somehow dangerous to your Japanese to start speaking too early. The main source cited for this is Professor Stephen Krashen, and it's a complete misinterpretation of what he says. Now, I've made a video about Professor Krashen, and I do disagree on some points with him. But broadly, I agree with the main thrust of what he says, and I think he's done a lot of good. But the idea that Professor Krashen is telling people not to start speaking for a very long time because it might do some terrible damage to your Japanese is simply untrue. To see what Professor Krashen really says, first of all, we have to put it in context. When he talks about language acquisition, he's mostly talking from within a classroom setting. He believes, and I believe, that stress is the great enemy of language acquisition. We shouldn't be worrying about making mistakes. We shouldn't be worrying about what other people might think. We should be using language as a means of communication. This is what I think. This is what Professor Krashen thinks. Now, in a classroom situation, it often happens that people are pushed by the teacher into speaking before they feel ready to do so, and this is very stressful in many cases. They're afraid of making mistakes, they're afraid of what the teacher will think, they're afraid of what other classmates will think, and this is just about the worst thing that can happen. And so because of this, what Professor Krashen means when he says silent period is that there should be a period where students aren't forced to speak, to output, until they feel a little more comfortable with the language, and the period's probably about 3 months in most cases. Now, the reason people pick up on this misinterpretation of Professor Krashen is because of the huge stress that a lot of current Japanese enthusiasts put on accent reduction. And I'm going to talk about that in just a moment. On the opposite side, just to cover the whole thing evenly, can we not speak at all and be successful in learning Japanese? Now, the reason I advocate speaking and writing is because the brain has a special place for language. Communication is vitally important to humans and communication engines like myself. So our wiring has a very special place for language. It's a necessity, and it has a lot of equipment for acquiring language which is not applied to anything other than a means of communication. It's not applied to games like chess or Tetris or the Spanish you sort of learned in school. It's only applied to real means of communication that you actually need to understand what's being said to you or what you're reading and to communicate what you want to communicate. So, can we learn language without speaking? And the answer to that is yes, because many successful English users on the internet do exactly that. They are actually very good at using English, but only in written form. But the point here is that they are using it as a means of communication. They're getting involved in online discussions. They're asking questions and getting answers. They're interacting every day in English, even though it's in written form. And there are people who really can't speak English very well at all, but are using it every day for communication. So long as online written communication is a part of your life, a part of your communication need, your brain will regard it as language. But we should note that it's far easier to do this in English than it is in Japanese. There are opportunities all over the internet for engagement in English, not so many in Japanese. But the point is that if you don't want to speak, if speaking is not something that you think you're ever going to do or that's important to your Japanese, there's nothing that says you have to do it. Everything depends on what you want from your Japanese, what your aims are. Part of the problem is that most foreigners using English do so because they have definite aims, they have definite uses for it, and they move into those uses as fast as they can. Many foreigners learning Japanese are just learning it without clear aims. And this makes them vulnerable to the propaganda of various groups and fads that arise around the subject. And to be honest, the English language Japanese learning community is more faddy and cranky and generally odd about the whole subject than any other learning community. If you're learning French or Korean or German, you're not going to encounter all this weirdness. And one of the weirdnesses that has grown and grown in recent years is the advent of accent reduction fanaticism. People who think that speaking Japanese without a foreign accent is really the pinnacle of learning Japanese. This is what, in other languages that people learn because they actually want to use them, as opposed to play with them, is called accent reduction. Very, very few non-native users of any language ever lose their accent if they start learning in adulthood, or even in many cases in their teens. Professors at universities, people who do all kinds of important jobs that involve using spoken English all the time, generally tend to go through their whole lives without completely losing their accent, and in many cases without losing it at all. If their accent is very strong, they may do some accent reduction, but the idea of reducing the accent to the point where nobody could tell that you weren't born in America is something most of them don't really have time to waste on. Accent reduction fanaticism, the idea that you have to speak Japanese perfectly or it's no good, is really something for hobbyists, something for people who have no real reason for using Japanese and just regard it as a kind of art form. It gives massive satisfaction to a few people with very good ears and a lot of time on their hands, and discourages and frightens a far greater number of people who have the massive task of reducing their accent to zero and learning the pitch accent of every word in the Japanese language, thrown at them on top of the straightforward task of acquiring the language. And it's a very strange thing for people who, on the whole, talk about acquiring language to add. These are the people, on the whole, who recommend HiSig, which is a huge, huge study project, nothing to do with acquiring language, recommend tons of Anki, and also recommend learning pitch accent, which again, nobody acquires. Foreigners don't acquire pitch accent. You actually have to study it and study it a lot. And when you've studied it and when you've learned it, what have you got? Not very much. Even Japanese native speakers who come to Tokyo, and what's called correct pitch accent is actually Tokyo pitch accent. Even native speakers from other regions of Japan who come to Tokyo at the beginning of their career and stay there for decades often don't pick up Tokyo pitch or don't completely pick it up. It's no big deal. But if Professor Creation is right, and I believe he is, that stress and worrying about making mistakes is the biggest killer of language acquisition, then adding pitch accent to all the other things people might worry about every time they open their mouths is just about the worst thing you could do to them. Alright, so we make this decision based on our own needs, our own requirements for the language. We may not find speaking important, we may never have an opportunity to speak very much, so it may not be something we want to spend time on learning how to do. That's a perfectly valid decision if that's the one you want to make. But supposing you do want to learn to speak, what's the best way to go about it? And in particular, how do you get started? I've talked in another video about using virtual reality to actually mingle with people who speak Japanese. There are, of course, other places where you can do this, but it isn't the best place to get started. The reason for this is that lots of people come into virtual reality hoping they will learn to speak Japanese, and even if they've got quite a bit of Japanese knowledge, they very often can't say very much. And when this happens, of course, they can't strike up any kind of communicative relationship, so it doesn't work for them and they give up. What we need to do, first of all, in most cases, is find some kind of a protected environment in which you can actually get some experience in speaking, and probably the best way to do this is to use a site like italki or any other site of a similar kind, and probably hire a conversation tutor. Now, conversation tutors, or community tutors as they're called on italki, are not qualified teachers, and that doesn't matter because you don't need a teacher. You need someone to talk Japanese with, to have conversations. It isn't very expensive to do this if you shop around, but if you don't have the funds, then you can do language exchange. The reason I don't recommend this so strongly is that, well, frankly, you're speaking English or your native language all day and every day, and you set aside an hour to work on Japanese. You don't really want to be spending half of that hour on exchanging English or your native language with your partner. If you have to do that, you have to do that. But if you can spare a little money, then it's probably a good idea to get someone who can help you and who is there fundamentally just to help you in speaking Japanese. It's a good idea to plan in advance what you want to talk about, look up words that you think you're going to need to use, and in the very early stages it's sometimes a good idea to get a picture with a lot going in that you can show the tutor and look at yourself and just describe various things going on in the picture. That's in the very early stages of learning. It depends how early you want to start. And again, that's completely up to you. You could start speaking right from the beginning, provided it doesn't apply stress to you, and it won't if you've decided to do it for yourself. Or you can start at any point you want to. Doesn't really matter. Now, once you've done that, once you've gained some confidence and some experience in speaking Japanese, you can then move to other places where you might speak, such as VR chat. I made a video about that, which I'll link. And there you can actually start using Japanese in conversation. You needn't worry, by the way, about meeting the accent reduction squad in VR chat. For the most part, they aren't there. They're probably too afraid of encountering a non-native speaker and contaminating their Japanese. And in any case, I get the impression that unless they're living in Japan, they don't actually use spoken Japanese as a means of communication. It's more of an art form to them. What you will encounter is native Japanese speakers, but also a lot of non-native Japanese speakers from Korea and China, Taiwan, Vietnam, and other parts of Asia. Why? Because Western people generally don't want to use Japanese as a means of communication. On the whole, they will revert to English the minute they've stopped practicing Japanese. With Asian learners of Japanese, it's rather different. So these are good people to mix with. There are exceptions, of course. Some Western learners of Japanese genuinely do want to use Japanese as a means of communication, and you're going to be one of them. If you have any questions or comments, please put them in the comments below, and I will answer as usual. I'd like to thank my Gold Kokeshi patrons, my producer angels, who make these videos possible, and all my patrons and supporters on Patreon and everywhere. I find it exciting that we are building new pathways into Japanese, getting rid of the nonsense of the Eihongo Japanese textbooks, getting rid of the myths of the accent reduction fanatics, getting rid, I hope, of the aversion that most Western learners of Japanese have to using Japanese. We're moving forward into a brighter future, and I'd like to thank you for attending this lesson. これからもよろしくお願いします。Class dismissed.